Good afternoon, and welcome to Green Alliance's latest webinar on the outcomes of COP30. My name is Nick Davies, and I'm Head of Climate Policy at Green Alliance. I'll be chairing today's discussion. So a decade on from COP21, where the world signed the Paris Agreement, we've seen some real progress with net zero pledges and climate action lowering the trajectory of future emissions. But as we all know, that progress is currently far too slow. And the UN has warned that the world is on track to exceed the 1.5 degree temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, with a high chance that the average of the next 5 years is going to exceed that target. And even while climate impacts are accelerating and the science is becoming ever more clear, climate denial has reared its ugly head again, with Trump pulling the world's second biggest polluter out of the Paris Agreement. Once again, those seeking to delay action have been emboldened. And we saw this in play at COP30, where obstruction from petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia blocked efforts by other countries, including the UK, to secure a recommitment to the UAE consensus to transition away from fossil fuels that had been in the text for COP28. To reflect on where we're at after a particularly chaotic COP, I'm joined by an incredible panel of speakers with many years of experience of engaging with the UN negotiations on climate change. Ed King, the Network Director for Energy and Diplomacy at Global Strategic Communications Council. Ed's a former journalist and founding editor of Climate Home News, and he writes an excellent newsletter on climate diplomacy. Catherine Pettengill, who's Executive Director of Climate Action Network UK, which brings together environment and development NGOs in the UK to advocate for climate justice. And Catherine has worked on climate resilience and adaptation in multiple countries across Africa and Asia. And Simon Sharp, who's Managing Director of S-Curve Economics and a former Deputy Director of the UK government's COP26 unit. He's also an author of a book on climate diplomacy and clean technology tipping points called 5 Times Faster. So we'll be hearing from each of these speakers, and hearing their perspectives, and then I'll ask a few questions to kickstart the Q&A, and then we'll open it to the floor for around half an hour Q&A. Please do ask questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat. I won't be following the chat. And please do upvote other people's questions that you think are most interesting. We'll try and get those answered. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Ed King, to give us his account of how COP30 played out on the ground in Belém, the outcomes, the performance of the presidency, and his reflections on the process 10 years on from Paris. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to everyone joining this webinar. I guess the first thing to say, having spent a week recovering from Belém, is that maybe speaking for a lot of people there, I'm just relieved I'm back in one piece. We had fires, we had floods, we had fire ants, intense rain, very loud air conditioning. It was the most crazy 2 weeks I've ever experienced at a COP. And I hope to God I never have to experience something like that again. In terms of where we're at, the Paris Agreement still exists. 194 countries are still in it. One has decided to depart, but I think we can't beat about the bush and pretend that the global state of climate diplomacy is in good shape. It is quite clearly not. This was a meeting, I would say, where kind of multilateral met multipolar. Previously, you'd had the EU, the US, small islands, least developed countries building some form of alliance which would push back against fossil fuel interests. That kind of alliance no longer exists. The EU is very weak. The US is obviously gone. Small islands have been seemingly bought off by the Saudi Arabians, or sort of, threatened into quiet by the Chinese in the Pacific. And Africa is in a really dismal state when it comes to debt, economic crisis, and a variety of sort of economic woes which are hitting it, meaning the continent just desperately needs more finance, which doesn't seem to be coming. So those traditional ways in which we viewed COPs have fundamentally changed. And I think we all just need to recognise that moving forward, this UN process and the way this is going to operate is not going to be the same again. And we're very much moving into a world where emerging economies will be dictating how fast we go globally on climate change. And that will have to sort of influence the way we sort of approach this from a strategic perspective moving forward. In terms of the outcomes at the COP, I'll run through them very quickly. There was an overall kind of what was called a mutirão text, which mutirão is a kind of Brazilian word for building stuff together. It turns out the whole text wasn't really built together, but it was built by the Brazilian presidency with a bit of help from trusted confidence. But it did have useful elements regarding tripling of adaptation finance, which I think Catherine might be able to speak to in a bit. It had a useful piece around the just transition, which is really important. It's vital that workers in fossil fuel sectors and other heavy industries get a better pathway to cleaner forms of work, although notably there was no money attached to that. There was a useful piece on information integrity, pushing back on the aims of big tech and the like to kind of undermine climate information all around the world. And there was a useful piece around these roadmaps. Nick mentioned that there was a kind of a bit of a pushback on the idea of ensuring fossil fuels remains in the text or in the process moving forward. I would say fossil fuels is in the text moving forward because, this is all about cutting emissions. This is all fundamentally about saving nature and cutting coal, oil, and gas use. And whichever way you look at it, that is the overall route of travel. But clearly, some countries didn't want that to be explicit in the text. So it was kind of noted outside, and the Brazilian presidency will kick this on and have said they will come with a plan later this year. 80 countries, I think it was 90 in the end, supported that, including the EU, LDCs, and UK. There's a useful piece on carbon brief you might want to have a look at about the maths behind that. But certainly there is a quorum of countries who really want to accelerate this. And I think this element of coalitions of the willing, significant chunks of countries who want to move faster, is also going to be something we're going to have to get used to moving forward. And it's probably going to be helpful in terms of where this process heads. The last thing I will say, and I think Simon might have views on this too, is there was a useful, if poorly communicated, element of the talks called the Action Agenda, AA for short, which obviously means something completely different to anyone on this webinar who is familiar with the AA. But this was the Action Agenda, which is about businesses, states and regions, regional leaders like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who turned up, deciding to move further and faster than others. And there were cumulatively well over $1 trillion worth of deals landed during the COP in relation to this action agenda. And I think moving forward, being able to bring all of those elements together, business and regional leadership, is going to be a key and a core part of this kind of UN process as it kind of heads into the 2030. So potentially less on the negotiations, but certainly more on being able to show those proof points and show what is happening, when it is happening, and also why it's happening. So that can be shared across governments, across countries, and that can hopefully accelerate progress globally. Nick, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It sounds like it was a very dramatic and chaotic COP. We'll now turn to Catherine. Catherine's going to give us the perspective from development and environment NGOs on the outcomes and on the UK's stance in the negotiations and her reflections on Paris 10 years on.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. Great to be here and also in the post-COP recovery process as well. But I thought I'd share some reflections and focus in on kind of three main areas. I think the first I want to focus in on is actually the dominance of the global north perspective, certainly what we've seen in the reporting from COP and how quite a lot of really important issues kind of got left behind in that. I also want to touch on the role of global civil society in the process, and then finally on the UK and how the UK performed. So, I mean, I was struck seeing the news coverage after COP that everything was talking about the fossil fuel roadmap, as if that was kind of what we all came to COP to get. But it's interesting to note it wasn't even on the agenda, right? So that wasn't what COP30 was meant to be about, but it's very much in the UK, in Europe, in global North countries has become the dominant narrative. And really, this COP should have been a real moment for some important progress on some other key issues like adaptation, like on gender. We got a new gender action plan agreed. On nature, there was efforts to kind of bring together closer synergies across the Rio conventions. I need to highlight and deal with the fact that provision of finance isn't moving forward, and this piece around just transition for communities and workers. And I just feel like that was really lost in a lot of the way the politics was approached at COP, but certainly in the way that it was reported afterwards. So those issues didn't get the attention they needed. And they always struggled to get attention, and this should have been the time they got that attention, and that didn't happen. One of the really important things around the UNFCCC process around these negotiations is it's a place where science and equity is meant to come together, and where both the kind of global North and the global South are able to bring their issues, bring their needs, and get them addressed. But I think we really saw a resurgence of that kind of mitigation first global North dominance with the narrative. And although, you know, it was really commendable to see work being done to try to get a strong outcome on fossil fuel phase out, it came at the expense of really everything else. And you know, developing countries really didn't kind of get their moment to get the issues that they wanted covered on the table. So it was really easy to paint a picture and a narrative of the bad guys of the countries blocking that. But I think we need to remember that also the bad guys here were, you know, where was the finance? We've a year on from the finance COP that didn't deliver, and developed countries have slashed their ODA budgets. They haven't provided additional finance, and they didn't come to this COP with finance. So I think there's a much more nuanced story that didn't necessarily come out in the reporting. In terms of the role of global civil society, I think there's two key things I wanted to highlight. The first is there is a worrying trend in this process that more of the negotiations are going to closed door discussions where we're not able to really see what countries are saying, or you know, kind of how hard they're pushing to water things down. That was really noticeable at this COP, with really kind of the last 4 days of negotiations being essentially behind closed doors. And that's a real shame given how recognised civil society and observers are in this process. We have formal constituencies, we have a formal role to play, but if we're shut out of negotiations, then you know you can kind of question what we were doing there really for that last few weeks and the last few days. Sorry, it felt like weeks. And you know those last few days run on kind of rumour mill and who's saying what and who's doing what, but it's not under the glare of the public eye. It's not under the ability of observers to kind of highlight bad behaviour coming from different negotiators. So that's a trend we've seen in the last couple of years, but definitely amplified at this COP, and that needs addressing. But one thing we did do is stand strong as civil society. In the last few years, we've had kind of one escalation campaign that we've all got behind. And this year it was the just transition piece. It was this global mechanism that was one of the outcomes of COP, one of those few outcomes. And I think that's really important for us to remember as civil society, that kind of when we stand together united, we really can push and get a concrete outcome, even in these really tricky geopolitical times. So the just transition outcome didn't get the headlines, didn't get all the attention, but it was a really hard fought for one win by the developing countries and civil society, and something we should be really, really proud of. And then just briefly on the role of the UK, in the context of the negotiations, we've got to remember that the UK is the 5th largest historical emitter and the 6th largest economy. So they should be playing an outsized role in going further and faster and doing the most. Yet, we know going into this COP, finance was the most contentious issue, and the UK has cut its aid budget again and did not come forward with climate finance, even though the current climate finance commitment ends in March. So it was a real problem, I think, for the UK and other countries coming into COP. The UK was really well aligned on some of the other issues we cared about: gender, adaptation, nature. But the key issue was we really needed them to fight for that in the closing stages, and this kind of fight for the fossil fuel roadmap kind of took over everything, and we didn't see those really strong positions and really strong advocating to keep some of this other stuff on the agenda and at the forefront. So yeah, I would conclude by saying it was really admirable to see that push from the UK for this fossil fuel issue. But given that wasn't what we came to COP for, it really could have done with a bit more of the political attention being focused on some of these other really important issues. And particularly, I think a big question for the process moving forward: if there's not real finance on the table, how much further can we go with this? Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. That's really interesting to hear that nuance behind the headlines, and we'll explore some of the issues around adaptation finance in the Q&A. Finally, let's come to Simon Sharp to give us a perspective of somebody that's been involved in the negotiations for the UK delegation, and also hear his reflections on how the COP process might be reformed to deliver faster progress. Simon.
Thanks, Nick. And of course, these days I attend COP in an independent capacity. Ed mentioned the increasing importance of what people call the action agenda. And that's very much what I take an interest in, because it's actions that actually solve this problem eventually, or fail to. There were a couple of things I thought were significant at COP30. One, of course, was the effort that Brazil made to bring together a new coalition of countries, a new institutional arrangement that they called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And that was set up to try to provide a reliable flow of finance to countries that preserve their forests. And they were aiming for about $125 billion to create a fund where the returns on that investment would be used for incentivizing forest conservation. They've got about $5 billion committed so far. So, and that came from Brazil themselves, Indonesia and Norway, and then some smaller contributions from other countries. I don't think the UK has put any money in yet, which is a shame. So on the plus side, it was a very serious initiative to solve one of the most difficult problems of emissions reduction. On the minus side, there's clearly a lot of need for more resource to be put into that. Hopefully that can still happen over coming years. Another thing that I thought was significant about COP30 was far more discussion of trade than ever before. And in part, of course, that was a big rhetorical mudslinging exercise within the formal negotiations, where a lot of countries were implicitly criticizing the EU and its carbon border adjustment measure. But outside the negotiations, there was also a lot of discussion of trade, and it was more constructive. Brazil launched something they called an integrated forum on climate change and trade, which didn't have very much detail attached to it, but it was strongly implied that it would be useful for discussions relevant to deforestation and also about industrial decarbonization, where trade is really at the heart of the problem. And it was quite, I thought, encouraging to see China represented at ministerial level at the launch of that forum. People often assume that China never joins these kind of practical cooperation initiatives, but sometimes it does. And it seems that a country like Brazil has the power to convene countries like China, as well as developed countries, and bring them together on these kind of issues. Also, something else related to that, a bit more down in the detail, but I think very significant, was an agreement by the steel industry associations of Europe and China, which together cover over 60% of global steel production, to work together on standards for near zero emission steel. So those were probably the two most significant themes, I think, the forests and the trade. But of course, there are many, many other examples going on of countries coming together along with businesses and civil society actors to try and solve practical problems. It's impossible to keep track of all of them. Just one other I mentioned, because I was there when it was announced, Brazil and Mexico both joining the Global Memorandum of Understanding on Zero Emission Medium and Heavy Duty Vehicles. In other words, joining a group that now includes a quarter of the global market for trucks and aligning on the pace of decarbonisation of heavy road transport. So those are modest steps in the right direction. The thing that I think is most important is, where is the political capital being spent currently? And in my view, far too much of it is being spent still trying to renegotiate global goals that effectively we agreed in 1992 in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The convention already establishes a zero emission goal for the global economy that was reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement in 2015. And it feels like, in a way, we keep trying to renegotiate these goals. Again in Dubai, trying to agree fossil fuel phase out. Again in Belém, trying to agree a global fossil fuel roadmap. Why is this happening? Well, it's because a process with 198 parties can only do global goal setting. It cannot do practical problem solving. And so to keep itself relevant, it keeps inventing new ways of trying to agree the global goals. And what we really should be doing is switching the focus of all of that political capital, that great effort, the time, the resource that goes into that, into efforts to actually solve the practical problems of the low carbon transition, the things to do with finance and trade, and very similarly on the side of adaptation and resilience, the problems that are systemic and global and can be solved better by countries working together than they can do individually. And a crucial thing here is, you look at any of those practical approaches, they don't need the permission of Saudi Arabia. They don't need 198 countries to agree on exactly the same thing. They just need enough of the right actors with enough of a shared or aligned interest that they can move forward. So my feeling is there's still something of a failure of the imagination in climate change diplomacy, and we really need Europe, China, Brazil, India, and a few of the other countries with the most weight in the global economy to get serious about working together on the practical actions, not just the long-term targets.
Thanks, Simon. It was really good to hear there that there are some positive movements coming out of the process on trade, and to hear your reflections on how the consensus-based approach of COP could be maybe sped up with different tracks there. I'll just kick off with the Q&A firstly with a question to Catherine, but please do others join in if you have perspectives on this as well. But Catherine, there was an agreement to call for a tripling of adaptation finance by 2035, but no clarity on exactly how that would be delivered. How credible is that call going to be in practice, especially given the record of developed countries and actually meeting previous finance pledges? And if all the panelists can turn their cameras on now, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, adaptation, and particularly adaptation finance, is one of these really important issues that often gets left behind. And it's interesting to note that we shouldn't really need this kind of target, right? Because there's agreement on a balance of finance language. So mitigation and adaptation finance should be balanced, but all we've ever seen is an underinvestment in adaptation, this really crucial developing country priority. So at Glasgow, with the UK COP, the UK managed to secure this incredible agreement to double adaptation finance by 2025. So that would have taken it to 40 billion. Worth noting that's still not 50% of the 100 billion target, right? So we're still not getting the balance, but it was shining the light on the fact that needs to scale up quite significantly. So with that agreement ending, that was by 2025, we're in 2025, everyone was saying, right, what next? This COP has to agree kind of what comes next. And what developing countries were calling for was a tripling of the doubling, right? So then, from now until 2030, how do we turn that 40 billion a year into 120 billion? We got a tripling agreed, but we didn't get a lot of that crucial information around it to really kind of make concrete kind of, a tripling of what, from what year, from what amounts, and also kind of how that was going to be achieved. And it was also kicked down the line for 5 years later than was being asked for, so by 2035. So there's kind of mixed views about it, to be honest. I mean, I think it's really important we got something. It's really important that we keep shining a light on the fact that adaptation finance is consistently under-resourced and that we need these collective efforts to keep us on track and keep highlighting that countries need to be doing more. With the level of ambiguity around it, I think we've also got a bit of a job to do of just expectation setting. Just because there wasn't a baseline year, just because there wasn't kind of clear amounts, I think we need to just kind of normalize that the existing goal ended this year, this agreement was made this year, so this is the baseline, right? And we move forward from this point. Others may argue that, but I think that's a reasonable expectation, particularly that civil society should hold governments accountable for. But yeah, lots of question marks still really about what type of money this will be, whether it will be high quality public finance, which we know is the majority of what's needed for adaptation, who will be responsible, how it will materialize. But we've got that important kind of commitment to keep coming back to and keeps testing and tracking, is the world on course for delivering this?
Thanks, Catherine. I'll ask a question now to, I think Ed and Simon could probably provide perspectives on this. You both mentioned the need for more coalitions of the willing to bypass the COP process to some degree and prevent the foot dragging from countries like Saudi Arabia. Countries have agreed to meet to discuss a roadmap away from fossil fuels at an international conference in April, which I believe is going to be hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands jointly. Do you see this as a potential forum for delivering faster progress?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I pick up on, it is very easy to blame Saudi Arabia for pretty much everything, and I'm all in for that. I mean, they're an easy country to blame, but I do think it's quite easy for us just to say it was Saudi Arabia's fault. I mean, there was quite clearly a bigger game plan here when it comes to blocking the fossil fuel roadmap, and it was not merely Riyadh, which was, to be honest, more concerned with being in Washington DC striking deals with Donald Trump. There was a far broader emerging economy push, but as Catherine said too, it's not on for richer countries to turn up to these meetings with a plan to push through a roadmap, but then not come with any money, because what's the point in having any of this if there's no money to deliver it? It's like coming to the UK government sort of delivering policies, but then no extra budget attached to it. It's kind of almost ridiculous. In terms of the Colombia piece, I do think it's interesting. I think it could potentially be interesting if we have this group of 90 countries that push for a roadmap. Hopefully they all turn up to the Colombia meeting. Hopefully they turn up to the future meetings through next year and continue the pressure. I think if they don't, then they severely risk undermining their credibility. And I think any of those countries which pushed hard for the roadmap, who doesn't follow through 2026 and beyond, will look ridiculous given how much they put on the line in Belém. So I really hope they do push it through. I think there are doubts about how this could pan out. Colombia has got an election next year. It's a country that has quite severe diplomatic issues with a lot of the countries around it. I think it was fairly clear by how the COP in Belém closed that Colombia and Brazil do not like each other, but at a diplomatic level at least. So let's see. But I think the coalitions of the willing piece is something to kind of keep an eye on. And I think certainly with the current UK government and UK kind of leadership, um, that is certainly something they will be continuing to push. And to be fair, the UK has a good record when it comes to delivering on the transition, so it should be well placed to be able to work with governments on that.
Simon, do you want to come in on this? You mentioned a very interesting one there on heavy goods vehicles, which we know are a really key area of decarbonising transport.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And completely agree with what Ed said. I often use Saudi Arabia as a shorthand for blockers, but of course Ed's right that China and India and many other countries that are crucial to this transition were opposed to the wording about a roadmap on fossil fuels. So my view is that was just the wrong thing to be trying to agree. Wrong in terms of participation, wrong in terms of scope. What does it even mean to have a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels? The problems we have to solve that are to do with burning fossil fuels in electricity generation are very different from the problems about burning fossils in transport, and those are very different from industry. So what does it mean? There are different things that have to be done. The reason China and India have always been quite negative in the international negotiations is they find it really difficult to commit to exactly what are they doing across the entire economy, getting rid of all of the energy that we currently use in a certain time frame. It's too big. That scope is too big to be useful. So no, I don't expect this new roadmap thing with 90 countries to be useful at all. The scope is far too big. You can't usefully discuss anything when your scope is that big. It's like getting all the countries around the world together and saying, let's have a discussion about world peace. You won't reach any peace agreements that way. You need different countries for different things. If you're talking about getting oil out of road transport, get the EU, China, and California around the table. Together, you have over half of the global car market. If you want to talk about preserving forests, you need Indonesia, Malaysia, the Congo, Ghana, those countries around the table. It's different. And again, if you want to talk about the power sector, what's the real challenge now? Well, it's the cost of capital for deploying renewable power in developing countries, where it can be 5 times higher than it is in advanced countries. How do you deal with that? Well, probably through risk guarantees and things like that. Now, there's a huge shared interest between the EU and China in providing that kind of support to developing countries. That's the kind of thing they should be doing. And the Chinese really, they're not against that. They have a massive interest in it because they're the world's biggest exporter of clean technologies by far. So you have to pick the right problems to solve with the right countries. And crucial focus there is the focus is on actions, not targets. The elimination of fossil fuels is where we'll get in the end, but we'll only get there if we solve the problems that need to be solved along the way. We start doing that now.
Thanks, Simon and Ed. Both really interesting reflections there. And it sounds like we need tighter, more clearly defined coalitions of the winning that focus on those specific actions. I'm going to move to the questions in the Q&A chat, and I'll just encourage participants to vote up questions that you'd like to see answered. Touching on that, there's a question in the Q&A about how optimistic you all are about the future of the COP process, and given what you've said about the coalition of the willing, there might be an interesting one for you to answer. So, is the process still fit for purpose moving forward, and what are your thoughts about the overall negotiations and their relevance?
You want me to pick up on that, Nick?
Yeah, so Ed, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, optimistic about the process. Well, I desperately hope that the process can change. And, well, no, let me put that differently. The process won't change. Governments need to understand what it can do and what it can't do. There is always a trade-off between breadth and depth in diplomacy. a UN negotiation process with 198 parties has maximum breadth, so it has minimum depth. So the only thing it can do is global goal setting and norm setting. Recognize that and keep using it for that, because that's what it does well with a high degree of legitimacy. Do not expect it to solve the difficult systemic problems of eliminating fossil fuels from the global economy and strengthening adaptation to climate risks. It will not do that. If we need to do that, if we want to do that, then we have to create the right institutions for achieving that. And those will need to be, in terms of emissions, sector focused, in terms of adaptation and resilience, problem focused, and they will need to have the right participation. And you can call it coalitions of the willing. I don't normally call it that myself. It's a negotiation among the influential. That's what it needs to be. Don't assume that they all agree with each other when they come to the table. They may not. And what we don't need is lots and lots more groups of Western Europeans and North Americans. We need Europe, China, India, Brazil, and others with that economic weight to come together. Only they can change global markets structurally at the pace that we need to avoid dangerous climate change.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Ed, you want to come in there?
I just agree with I'd agree with those sentiments. I feel a bit sorry sometimes for the UN staffers who work very hard at the UNFCCC. It's not really their fault because the process is fundamentally lots of governments coming together. And maybe there's a need for everyone in the sort of the so-called climate community to kind of reappraise what we want from each year and refocus on where we really want to apply pressure. What I would say is having that meeting every year does draw in. If you think about the journalists who were there, you had all of the major broadcasters. You had well over 1,000 journalists from all around the world, a lot from the UK, and it does offer you that opportunity to really put pressure on individual governments at certain points in the year. And some of those governments don't have that pressure at home, and they really do not like being put under the microscope. And when you look at the floods that we've just had in Southeast Asia, and the lack of influence some of those countries have at home and even in their regional settings, it's still an important moment to be able to put that focus on. But as Simon says, looking at more now as a kind of goal setting, norm setting, as opposed to we're going to see some amazing breakthrough, I think is probably the way to go.
Thanks, Ed. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, it has an enormously important role for that norm setting piece and for also the equality piece and everyone having an equal voice and seat at the table. That doesn't happen anywhere else. And there is a risk that kind of going off into these kind of other spaces that it's the same countries getting left behind again and again. But I think we also need to think about how the UN system and the conventions speak to each other as well and influence each other. I think it's worth noting at the same time as the COP negotiations, there was the UN tax convention negotiations in Nairobi and a push for recognition of kind of polluter pays taxation in that. The process, the UNFCCC process has kind of got us to the shared vision of what we need to do, but how we do that needs to come through in lots of other spaces as well. We need to be talking about how we do debt reform, tax reform, trade, all these other issues, and how the kind of assertions and visions that have been signed up to in the Paris Agreement can be read across and directly into influencing these other spaces. That's a really important element of the process moving forward now, I think.
Got quite a few questions coming through on this idea of practical action by other countries. So a question from Jeffrey Lean. I'll direct it to Simon first, I think, but if others want to come in, that would be good. Jeffrey said, one area where there could practical action by key countries could be fruitful is in addressing methane. It's responsible for 1/3 of current warming, and cutting it has a much quicker effect than reducing CO2. So, and offers the only remaining chance of staying around 1.5 degrees. What does the panel think of this? Simon, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, methane mostly comes from two places. One is the oil and gas industry itself, and the other is agriculture, particularly livestock. And so when we talk about cooperation on methane, I think it's better to talk about cooperation in one or other of those particular economic sectors and think about how you can change it. And I agree that there are real opportunities there. I think, for example, the oil and gas methane, a lot of it is just leaks, it's burning it off. And it would be quite possible, say, for Europe and China to align on methane standards that they apply to gas imports. They're two of the largest gas importing markets in the world. If they use their combined market power to impose tough standards, then they could really force gas producers in other countries all over the world to cut their methane emissions. I think in terms of livestock, it's much more difficult, but developing different forms of cattle feed that reduce, the emissions from cows burping and farting, that's a really difficult problem, and one there where there's still probably a lot of good scope for collaboration on research and development, and later on safety standards for cattle feed, so that countries agree on what's effective and safe, and they can grow the market for that globally.
Ed, do you have any perspectives on methane to add?
Absolutely not. Nothing that can be constructively helpful based on what Simon said, but it is massively important. And all of the oil and gas companies, having committed to address methane in 2015, seem to have done absolutely nothing about it. So more scrutiny on them too would be important.
Yeah, Catherine, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, just to say all these issues, right, need to have the attention on it, and particularly, nature, forest and land use as well, as part of the 1.5 story that often gets overlooked as well. So yeah, we do need to get really kind of practical and detailed across all the different areas.
Yeah. We've got another question here on this idea of coalitions of influential countries to negotiate on practical actions. Pete Brotherton is asking: do the institutions to get real progress exist, or do we need to set them up? And whose job would that be to set that up? Ed, do you have an answer on that?
Well, I mean, one useful thing to reflect on, and this very much framed coming into Belém, was the fact that this year the International Maritime Organization was due to sign off on what was going to be a pretty significant global levy on shipping emissions. I don't have all the figures at the back of my head, but the shipping sector accounts for a fairly hefty chunk of global emissions. I think Simon will probably have the stats, but they were going to do it, and then and it was pretty much agreed. I think in April this year, most countries voted in support of it. The US kind of abstained, but then the US came in to wreck it in October. So I suppose the risk, the positive element of these coalitions is that you can actually get more done with a smaller group. The risk is if you go small, then it's easier to nobble different countries, and they lack that kind of meta protection that going together in a mass takes you. So I don't have. Simon mentioned how some of the kind of Californian Europeans could come together on vehicles, and maybe he could speak to that. But I think we just need to be aware that there's a risk opportunity piece here, and as the shipping piece sort of illustrated quite clearly, even when business is for it, even when the majority of countries are originally for it, if someone really wants to try and wreck it, they can. So I suppose we just collectively need to be quite aware of that sort of that dimension.
Simon, do you want to come in on the institutional architecture there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the simple answer to the question is that on the whole, no, we don't have the institutions that we need to support practical cooperation on transitions between groups of countries that have enough collective leverage to make those transitions happen in global markets. We don't have those institutions. And whose job is it to create them? It's the job of governments. Governments every century or so, in fact, much more often than that, but every century or so in a real big wave, They need to realize that there are a different set of global problems that need solving, and they need to create a new set of institutions. We had one of those waves after the Second World War, where the focus was on peace and security and human rights. We need one of those waves of institution building now, where the focus is on sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, and so on. The institutional arrangements that we have are hopelessly inadequate. The IMO, Ed mentioned, is an interesting example because shipping and aviation are two sectors where we do have some sort of governance institution with global rule setting power. That's quite useful. The unfortunate thing is those institutions were not created for this purpose. They were created a long time ago for a different purpose, mostly to do with safety and security in those sectors. So they were designed to be good at that. For that kind of thing, you need very wide-scale participation and you need consensus. In the process of a technology transition, you want that consensus at the end, but you cannot have it at the beginning. At the beginning, you need a really small group to get things started. You know, solar power started off with the Americans, the Japanese, the Australians, and the Chinese. Right now in shipping, we have virtually no long distance zero emission ships in the water. So you need to start that process. You need a few countries to cooperate on the first major shipping routes with low-level subsidies or mandates that get the first zero-emission ships into the water. That's what you need to happen. There are groups like the Global Maritime Forum coordinating businesses, national governments, city governments, trying to make that happen. But as with so many of these efforts, they don't yet have the real political focus. The IMO is still too big. It's still got too many partners to be able to agree what needs to be done at this extremely early stage of the shipping transition. So it was a brilliant effort at diplomacy. A huge number of people deserve great credit. And despite everything I've said about the IMO not being designed for this purpose, it almost did it. It was only spiked by an unusually aggressively negative US government. Unfortunately, that turned out to be enough. So again, there, I think, in that sector, as in the others, we don't actually have the institutional arrangements that we need.
Thanks, Simon. This is a really fascinating discussion. I want to come back to the IMO in a moment, but first ask a question to Catherine from Chloe at the Carbon Trust. She says she noticed that most of the countries backing the deforestation roadmap were forest nations themselves. Does the panel think that that will be sufficient enough, or will it be important for others to come on board? Should it be countries who import most forest products, have most money and most historical emissions? And it's notable, I would add, that the UK didn't sign up to that, and also hasn't implemented its forest commodities regulations, which it promised over a year ago. Catherine, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting challenge, right? This idea of kind of groups that will take a lead on different issues. In some cases, you know, as the other panelists were saying, you need kind of the small group to get it started and set a norm, and everyone else come on board. But also, you know, there's the question of kind of, you know, who regulates who, and you know, who's going to have the kind of highest level of ambition. I think on forests, it's very clear it needs to be the forest nations and the consumer nations. You know, the value chain needs to be kind of brought together to kind of really tackle these issues. But I wanted just to pick up a bit more on that institutional arrangements piece we were talking about, because I think this is a big question now for the process: is what institutions do we need and we want, and which ones would fit well under the UNFCCC. Certainly this win we had on just transition, we really felt it was important to have a global institution under the UNFCCC, because it has that 1.5 degree framing and that equity framing that becomes the touchstone for what just transition looks like in all contexts around the world. It can become like the centre of expertise for kind of trade discussions, for workers' rights, for learning, because no one's done a just transition, right? We're all in this together, and it's really important to kind of learn from each other. But a big pushback that we got to that proposal was particularly from developed countries, that didn't want more institutional arrangements, that feel like the process is already overburdened and expensive, right? Every time we kind of agree a new institution, someone's got to pay for it. You need a secretariat, it needs to meet, it needs to... So I think we still need to do some decent thinking and creative thinking about how we do that. We can't just stop the process from growing now because we say it's too big and it's too expensive. There are still things we need to do, but what is the best way to do it? How do we bring the best actors together? And how do those things touch into other processes? Because nothing is climate in isolation or tax in isolation or any of these issues anymore. So I think that's definitely worth some decent time and thinking moving forward over the next couple of years, is what are the institutional arrangements that we need and where do they best sit in the architecture that we have?
Thanks, Catherine. Ed, Simon, do you want to come back in on that?
No, I'd love to add a comment
Simon.
on that. Thanks, Chloe, for asking that question. I really agree with the spirit of the question. The value of international trade in forest risk agricultural commodities is around 100 times greater than the annual flows of finance that are dedicated to protecting forests. And of course, it's that trade that creates one of the largest incentives for destroying forests. So you have to align that trade and the incentives it brings with keeping the forest standing. What the Brazilians have done is trying to address one half of the problem, which is provide an incentive for forest conservation. The other half of the problem also needs to be solved, removing the incentive for forest destruction. What's been such a shame so far is the only country that's tried to do anything, bloc that's tried to be serious on this, is the EU. The UK has been following, of course, trying to design standards applied to imports of agricultural commodities that require them not to have caused deforestation. But in my view, it was really wrong to try and do that unilaterally and just with a few little consultations here and there. Actually, the EU should have sat down with the major forest countries and the agricultural commodity producer countries on an equal basis and said, look, there is this shared problem that we have. How shall we try and solve it together? And the EU didn't do that. Of course, I don't want to just criticize the EU. Nobody else did it either. Some country needs to step forward and begin convening that dialogue that brings trade standards, support to smallholder farmers, and forest protection finance all together. It's a package that will need to be agreed.
Thanks, Simon. Going to come back to Ed now, and that question of what happened at the IMO, where the US torpedoed that process. Are we lucky that they didn't send a delegation and try to actually be more active in opposing action in Belém? Any comments on that?
I don't know. There's part of me that wonders if they had sent a delegation, it would have galvanized countries a bit more, and they would have got their act together a bit early. I mean, it's hard. It's a good question, but it's a classic hypothetical, and it's impossible to say. All we know is that there are enough countries, as it stands, who did not want to kind of agree to any kind of tougher roadmap moving forward. What I would say in my kind of reflections on the meeting are that that to Simon's point, we have the Paris Agreement, which mandates these 5-year climate plans that countries need to come forward. We have a global review every 5 years, which is called the stocktake. There are fundamental structures in place now for countries to be making the transition. There is a good argument to say whether or not we need to be focusing on these kind of winning a piece of paper at a global talks called a roadmap, or whether we need to be working out how we can shift smaller blocks and get them to move faster. And I think what is really interesting for me, just finally, that there was a really poor Indian government press release that came out a month ago. And it was so poorly written, no one picked up on it. But it said that in July, India ran half of its power grid on clean energy, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Only did it for a day, July the 29th. But if you think about it, that's really hot in India that time of year. and there's a hell of a lot of air conditioning being used. And if India is now at the stage where it could run half its power grid just for a day on clean energy, then you'd assume if the progress continues within the next 5, 6 years, that will increase potentially exponentially and will be on a far better track. So I think focusing on the transparency, the reporting, understanding where countries are needs to be a priority moving forward. Obviously, the US is going to dominate because it's just crazy politics. But I think if we look too much at the US and just sort of believe everything that comes out of there, we're probably at risk of missing, the bigger picture and a better story.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. I want you all to give me the one thing that you'd like to see in the international negotiations going forward. Catherine, can I start with you? Put you on the spot there. Sorry.
I mean, money. That's what we need, right? The developed countries need to cough up. You know, we caused the problem. We got rich whilst doing it. We've got to share that wealth around. We've got to support. We've got to get real about what developing countries need. We can't leave anyone behind because of climate change impacts or because of the transition, right? Everyone should have a seat at the table, and we need to be moving towards a fairer future for everyone. So yeah, we need to get real about money.
Simon?
Institutions and practical cooperation. We already talked about them both. Just emphasize, I think both China and the EU need to stop being as inward-looking as they have been on climate diplomacy for the past 3 decades and recognize where their interests currently are and get serious about working together with each other and with the other economies that matter in each of the different problems to solve.
Thank you. Ed, final word to you.
Better coffee and delivery on existing promises as opposed to setting new targets.
Great. Thanks all for a really insightful discussion, and thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. Bring the meeting to a close. Thanks.